Thank you for joining us tonight, and thanks for the assistance of Metro TV. My name is Pam Greenwell. I serve as president of the Louisville Forum, and I would like to take this opportunity to invite you to join us at a future meeting. We gather on the second Wednesday of every month at lunchtime at Vincenzo's Restaurant in downtown Louisville. For more information on the Louisville Forum and our programs, or to make reservations, please visit our website at louisvilleforum.org. First, I would like to thank our sponsors of this year's annual dinner, Jewish Heart Care, part of Kentucky One Health, and BB&T Insurance Services. Our program tonight is Gun Violence, What Should We Do? Before our speakers begin, I would ask that all applause or other comments be held until the end of the entire program. I appreciate your cooperation. Our first speaker is Professor Russ Weaver. Professor Weaver graduated cum laude from the University of Missouri School of Law. Professor Weaver began teaching at the Louis D. Brandeis School of Law in 1982 and holds the rank of Professor of Law and Distinguished University Scholar. He teaches constitutional law, advanced constitutional law, and several other subjects. He has been awarded the President's Award for Outstanding Research, Scholarship, and Creative Activity in the field of social science, and also for distinguished service. Professor Weaver is particularly noted for his work in the constitutional law area. He served as a consultant to the constitutional drafting commissions of Belarus and Kyrgyzstan, and as a commentator on the Russian Constitution. Professor Weaver.
Thank you, Pam. I'm happy to be here. The Second Amendment, it's an unusual amendment because until recently, it was probably one of the least litigated, least discussed amendments in the Constitution. Well, there's actually one that was less litigated, which is the courting of American troops in people's houses. But, you know, I think back to my law school career when I took con law, we spent no time whatsoever on the Second Amendment. When I think of my own constitutional law casebook, we now have a chapter on the First Amendment, on the Second Amendment, but in the prior edition, we had nothing, absolutely nothing. Because I think for many years, it was assumed that the Second Amendment had very limited application, that basically it applied to militias rather than to individuals. And it's only in the last 10 years or so that we've started to get a lot of litigation, a lot of decisions, basically dealing with this fundamental question of whether it's an individual right or whether it's a right that extends to state militias. And however you define that, that can be defined in lots of different ways. That issue was decided by the Supreme Court, ultimately in favor of suggesting that it applies, that there is this individual right to keep and bear arms. So doesn't mean the militia part is gone. That really hasn't been litigated much in recent years. But there clearly is now an individual right to possess and bear arms that I'd say 10 years ago, if you'd asked me, is there that individual right? I would have said, I don't know. I'm not sure we do have that right. I heard Chief Justice Berger, then Chief Justice Berger, interviewed about this issue, and he said, no, there is no individual right. There's just a right on the part of militias. So there's been a lot of debate. We now have had a couple major decisions which tell us that the individual right clearly exists. We have a lot of unanswered questions about what does it mean? How far does it extend? Does it extend to just things like revolvers or rifles, or does it extend to assault weapons? And really, you can argue that in all sorts of different ways. And I'm not here to necessarily take a position because I don't know where the court's going to go with a lot of this. But when you look at the Second Amendment, I mean, it was originally stemmed from our history in England, where the British monarchs would come in and take arms away from dissident groups so that they couldn't rebel. And of course, if you view it in that way, and in fact it was originally viewed as a protection against the federal government, and if you view it in that way, then we might say, well, we might want to extend the Second Amendment to cover more than just individual weapons because, well, it's militias. They're Army-like, and so we might want to protect more different types of weapons. I don't think that's where the court's going right now. In general, the court has said that you can probably prohibit anything that's considered to be unusual and dangerous. So, but in terms of limitations, specific limitations, the court really hasn't told us that much yet. We've got some lower court decisions, but not necessarily conclusive, and we're just going to have to wait to see where it goes. And I think I'm going to stop there because that sets the stage, and then I can take questions when we come to the question part of the program.
Our second speaker is Charles Riggs. Charles Riggs' father was a firearms instructor for the Kentucky State Police. Charles is the founder of the Kentucky Concealed Carry Coalition, known as KC3. It was founded in 1995. Charles worked with Democratic Representative Robert Dameron to pass Kentucky's concealed deadly weapons law, and he and KC3 have continued to represent the thousands of Kentuckians who own and bear arms. Charles believes in the right to self-defense and the right to bear arms for defense of self and state. Mr. Riggs.
I'd like to point out that I'm not the founder of KC3. I'm one of the co-founders. I don't want to take credit for what is a superb organization strictly for myself. I'd love to, but they wouldn't let me get away with that. We're talking about gun violence. I want you to go back with me to the 1950s. Now, I know there are probably a few of you in the room who were around then, but kids drove to school with guns in their trucks. They kept shotguns in their lockers to go hunting after school. They had shooting teams in high schools and in colleges. University of Kentucky still has a range in one of their buildings where people go to shoot and compete and meet. And then things changed. We got through the 60s, we got into the 70s, and now we have a society where a 10-year-old boy can be arrested for having what is plainly a plastic gun with an orange tip on the muzzle of it in school. And not just arrested, taken to the police station and interrogated and booked. And he's going to have to deal with the trauma of that for the rest of his life. That's the problem. In a time when people still understood the ownership and the responsible use of firearms, we didn't have the problems that we have with guns now. What we think we need to do is, first of all, change the language. We need to stop talking about gun violence. A gun is a tool. A gun is not a particular thing that causes violence. It's a tool in the hand of a person who has violence in their hearts. We're dealing with an attack on gun ownership that is malicious and seeks to demean and to confuse. The term assault weapon is a term of art deliberately created by a gentleman named Josh Sugarman in 1988 when they realized they were losing the argument on banning the possession of handguns. So they looked for a new cause célèbre. And he coined the term, which has no basis in any technical specification, so as to create fear in the minds and the hearts of those people who are not acquainted with the subject. An assault rifle, by military definition, is a medium caliber weapon, magazine fed, capable of fully automatic fire. Those are regulated. You can own one in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. There is a process by which you procure and are taxed upon it. But assault weapons do not exist, but people continue to use the term in the attempt to inflame emotional reactions in what has to be a rational discussion. And they're using it to insult people who stand up for the rights and who are gun owners. The problems that we have now, what changed between the 1950s and guns and cars to go hunting and 2012, where we're afraid of yet another violent incident? A couple of things changed. Schools changed. The people who took over the schools and took over the educational institution specifically, gradually, and totally removed firearms education from the schools. They made guns an object of phobia and terror to children. And they have succeeded in doing that expressly so that no one wants to have anything to do with guns. The other thing that's happened is the same people, from the same philosophical point of view, turned people who are mentally ill out onto the streets, where they don't have support programs, where they don't get their medications, where they don't get sufficient supervision, and we can't prevent them from getting guns in a criminal fashion. You know, it's the truth that criminals will always have access to things they should not have. That's what makes them criminals. Criminals steal, criminals attack, and restricting the property rights of law-abiding people in this nebulous attempt to control gun violence is an attack on society, and it's not going to work. So let's talk about, in reasonable, rational terms, without the sensationalism, about the actual facts, and about what we know has been done and can be reversed to return this to a rational society.
Our next speaker is Congressman John Yarmuth. Congressman Yarmuth was born in Louisville, attended Atherton High School and Yale University. He worked for Senator Marlowe Cook from 1971 to 1975 and returned to Louisville and founded Louisville Today magazine. Thereafter, he founded the weekly newspaper Leo. Congressman Yarmuth was elected to Congress in 2006 and is currently serving in his 4th term. Congressman Yarmuth has been an outspoken advocate for strengthening gun laws.
Well, thank you very much, Pam. It's a great pleasure to be here, and you left out the most important thing in my resume for tonight, and that is I'm a former board member of the Louisville Forum. I'm very proud to be one. It's good to be here to discuss a very, very important topic. Imagine for a moment that we didn't have a Second Amendment. I'm not advocating that we repeal it. Just imagine hypothetically that we don't have one. We have, in this society today, roughly 30,000 people who die as a result of guns every year, 11 to 12,000 murdered, the rest suicides, accidental deaths. We saw, as we did in Newtown, 20, 6, and 7-year-olds gunned down, beautiful innocent children. We saw my friend and colleague Gabby Giffords seriously wounded. People who had come to see her at a public event, exercising democracy, losing their lives. Today in Las Vegas, for those of you who haven't heard it yet, a gunfight broke out between 2 drivers, one driving a Maserati, one driving an SUV. One crashed into a taxi cab, it exploded, 4 people died. This is in front of the Bellagio Hotel. Now, all of those things, if there weren't a Second Amendment, what would the government's response be to that kind of carnage in our society? I submit it will be substantially more aggressive than anything we have seen in this country up till now. I believe that Americans, just like every human being on earth, have the right to defend themselves. As a matter of fact, Professor Weaver talked about the genesis of the Second Amendment and going back to Britain, and one of the interesting aspects of the Second Amendment is that in colonial governments and colonial constitutions was that they considered, many of them, the right to defend themselves, including the right to have guns in their homes to defend themselves, as a common law right and a natural right, and not something that needed to be ratified through an actual statute or a constitutional provision. So that right is well recognized throughout history. The question for us today is, how do we balance the rights to defend yourself, to engage in recreation? If we think that that's fun, to go out and hunt or shoot. It's part of the American culture. With the right of all citizens to be safe from the kind of violence that we see in this country. And as in every situation involving rights in this country, it's always a balancing of rights. And as I said in the statement I gave following the Newtown shooting, I think I have a right, and every American has a right, not to have a gun to defend myself. I have a right to be free from that obligation to have a gun to defend myself. It's interesting when you look at Kentucky, and Charles has been involved in the concealed carry law activity. Kentucky is one of the first states to actually draft a law, to adopt a law prohibiting the right to carry a concealed weapon. It was done prior to the Civil War, and we had to amend the Constitution of Kentucky to do it, because the Constitution of Kentucky, originally the 1792 Constitution, said you can't really restrict any rights where guns are concerned. But the citizens at that point, the politicians said, we think this is good because Henry Clay had been involved in a duel, and as you all know, we have a state constitution that when you get sworn in as a state officer, you have to swear you've never fought a duel. And now we've come 200 and something years later to a point at which public policy in some states almost suggests that we want you to fight a duel, that that's the way you save yourself, that's the way you protect yourself. As Wayne LaPierre said, the best defense for a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, which implies to me that you have to win a gunfight. America should be better than that, and American people have a right to expect more than that. I thought it was interesting that Charles made the statement that we've kind of demonized guns in this culture to the point where no one wants one, and that's why we have 300 million of them in society. I think the problem is exactly the opposite. When we talk about restricting rights, once again, no one is talking about restricting the right of people to defend themselves. I love the argument, well, I don't really love it, but I'm amused by the argument that if we do anything to curb gun violence in this country, that we are on a slippery slope to confiscation of guns or regulation, or universal registration of guns, and so forth. We passed a handgun ban in the Brady bill. Nothing more severe came down the road. No proposals were made. Then we passed the assault weapons ban. Nothing more serious has come down the road. Barack Obama was elected in 2008. The NRA goes apoplectic, says he's coming after your guns. There was no gun safety proposal made in the first administration of Barack Obama. It was only after Newtown and public outcry that this administration said it's time to do something to regulate gun violence. What we are proposing, what is on the table right now, universal background checks, supported by 92% of the American people in the most recent poll. 74% of NRA members agree with that. Recent poll in Kentucky, 75% agree with background checks, universal background checks. 65%, this was astounding to me, 65% of Kentuckians said they were in favor of registering guns with the state. So the American people understand that there is a question of balance here, that we have rights that need to be balanced, rights of people to be free from the fear of violence from guns and gun violence, as well as the rights of gun owners as defined in the Constitution and the Heller decision. So I think that these discussions are extremely valuable, and I'm glad to be a part of it, because I believe that working together and actually discussing them together instead of in parallel universes, we can actually come to an approach to dealing with gun violence that actually respects the rights of everyone. Thank you.